let me introduce Andrea, who is teaching at the Comenius University of Bratislava, and previously she was working at the Academy of Fine Arts and Design also at Bratislava. Her researches are revolving around the topics of official art, unofficial art and its social context, and she published her researches in several languages such as German, Slovakian, and English. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much to all you that you are participating here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to be a part of this Resonances project and to hear so many inspiring contributions. Thank you very much to all contributors also who contributed to this conference. So the title of my contribution is The Paradigm of Ostkunst in the Works of Tomáš Štrauss, and it connects really very good to Zsuzsa László's contribution, which we have heard. My contribution explores the background and the different uses of terminology related to the term Ostkunst in the works of Tomáš Štrauss. It explores the circumstances under which this term emerged, investigates its origins, and focuses on the context where it developed and its applications. My contribution is based on my study, Different Yet the Same Art, Paradigm of Ostkunst in Works of Tomáš Štrauss, that was published in the conference volume Ideas and Reflections, European and Slovak art historian Tomáš Štrauss. That was a conference that took place in Bratislava last year. So for those who might be interested and can read and understand Slovak, you can read more about this topic in more detailed analysis. For understanding the notion Ostkunst, as Štrauss considered it, is crucial to understand the Ostkunst-Westkunst discourse in Western Germany. So the first part of my talk will be dedicated to explanation of this discourse within Germany. In the second part of my presentation, I will focus on different aspects of term Ostkunst, on Strauss' theoretical incorporation of this term, on its definitions, analysis, but last but not least, on how it was used. So don't be surprised that I'm going to talk quite a lot about Germany and the inner German situation, because I think if we talk about East, we have talked a lot about East, it's also important to talk about West and its forms and its theories. In 1985, in his essay Ostkunst, but with a question mark, a development sketch of different yet similar art, Strauss posted that Ostkunst emerged in 1949. The evolution of art in Europe after the World War II was interrupted by the campaign against the cosmopolites in art that was conducted from Moscow between 1949 and 1950, and I quote, "Since that time we can talk about consciously generated model Ostkunst that was in opposition to Westkunst. Since 1949, the art and aesthetics are strictly separated into official and unofficial, but the borders between them are fluent, and it's impossible to separate them like it is possible in case of political borders." End of quote. The art dominated in GDR, that means the art that was created conform with the doctrine of socialist realism, was more or less similar to the official art of the other socialist countries. Strauss entered into the East-West conflict by his writings by reacting on the propaganda of Western Germany, who tried to demonize the art of the so-called Eastern Bloc and that instrumentalized the entire cultural field by not less ideological loaded mechanisms like it used to do the Communist Party in the so-called Eastern Bloc. Strauss was himself direct witness of the Cold War in the cultural field, and he tried to confine himself to this discourse that was generated by political events, by propaganda, and the related rhetorics. Strauss confined himself as solicitor of the idea of Central European space, in which the avant-garde and neo-avantgarde flourished and developed regardless of the ideological and political contents and rhetorical figures of the proponents of Western culture and so-called Westkunst. At the beginning, I stated that to understand the Ostkunst and Westkunst discourse is crucial to understand the specificity of the situation in Germany that generated an inner German conflict. It's important to understand that nowhere else in Europe the two ideologies were standing so close to each other like it was in Germany after the World War II. And it was exactly this inner German conflict in context of which the term Ostkunst was constituted and took its form. By turning the attention to the artificial construction of categories and strict division of Europe and European art in East and West, Štrauss tried to revise the dominant view of the Western art history at the beginning of the 1980s. At this point, I have to make clear that he arrived to Germany, to Western Germany. He emigrated there actually in 1981. So it was exactly the time when this East German, West German discourse was kind of generating new opinions, new theories, and that was a big tension at that time. In his essay Ostkunst, but with a question mark, a development sketch of different yet similar art, this essay was written already in 1981 for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung because Štrauss was a correspondent for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And later on it was published in Das Kunstwerk, a magazine in 1985, and it was also included in his monography 1995, Zwischen Ostkunst und Westkunst. So he tried to revise this dominant view of the Western art history at the beginning of the 1980s. In mentioned essay, he reacted to the exhibition Westkunst Contemporary Art after 1939 that took place in 1981 in Cologne in the fair halls. It was quite a huge exhibition. There were about 1,000 artworks displayed. So before we go deeper into Štrauss' reaction to this exhibition, it is important to present at least briefly the exhibition Westkunst, as it was the source and inspiration for Štrauss' critical view. The key persons of Westkunst were Klaus Ruhlberg, who was at that time the director of Museum Ludwig in Cologne, and also Kasper König, the founder of Skulpturprojekte Münster, and Laszlo Glotzer, who was professor of art history and originally Hungarian. The exhibition generated vivid discussion even before it was opened. The first problematic issue was its budget, because it cost 7 million Deutschmark, Western mark, which was extremely expensive. That was more than one documenta at that time. So it was a very problematic issue. The second problematic issue, but was after its opening because of its conception. In the catalog, Laszlo Glotzer posted that the show makes an attempt to complete the incomplete view of art history that dominated after the World War II. For example, there were exhibited artworks of later periods of classic modernist artists that were often very completely different as the avant-gardists' works, but still had impact and were inspiration for artists in the beginning of the 1960s. The critique of the Westkunst exhibition had different phases, and it happened on different levels. Štrauss was not the only one who went in critical discussion with it. There were numerous critical voices, text, reviews, like the ones from Klaus Honeff or Thomas Kellein. And at this place, I would like to mention also Conference Westkunst, where I participated in March. It was organized by Deutsches Forum für Kunstgeschichte in Paris. And at this conference, there were several contributions which analyzed this critique of Westkunst. Mathilde Arnaud presented a film, West Protest, created by young German artist Ulrike Rosenbach and a group of artists. And Ulrike Rosenbach spoke in this film that Westkunst exhibition is an exhibition which manipulates history, for example. And another contribution by Friederike Ziegler presented parallel exhibition named Passive Explosive, which was curated by Cordula Frowein, Gustav Metzger, and Klaus Stark, and this was a parallel exhibition which was very critical also to this Westkunst exhibition. So we have several forms of critique already at the time this exhibition took place. So what was the logic of the curators of Westkunst? In the introduction, in the catalog Laszlo Glotzer marks the exhibition as exhibition of thesis. The art of the 20th century should be presented in sense of the following questions. I quote, how far can we refer and use the art of which the time of its emergence is already a historic one? Is it appropriate, necessary, or yet possible today to refer to this art? And if yes, from which kind of art in the past? End of the quote. Curators stated further on that they raise a claim for the modernism of the 20th century. The artwork is not only a relic of the past, but has its influence and impact also for the present. We also have to keep in mind that this show was conceived at the end of the 1970s, so there is a need for reflecting it in the context of the rising monopoly of the Western art, and Western Germany tried to delimit itself from Eastern Germany as the only one medium of free neo-avantgarde art and the provider of the continuity of modernism. So now let's get back to Štrauss and to his essay. In his essay Ostkunst, but with a question mark, he claimed that it is sheer not understandable how Laszlo Glotzer in the catalog could state the simplified ideological thesis about political relations of modern art and democracy. Štrauss does not agree, especially with the assumption that avant-gardist modern art is exclusively a product of free and Western world. He addresses ironically, and I quote, the term Westkunst means in the geographical definition that radical art, that we can call by other word the avant-garde art. What lies beyond USA or in Europe, eastern from Lüneburg, is excluded from connection and relation with avant-garde, comes from evil or simply doesn't exist. End of the quote. Then he continues his critical view in relation to the historical frame of Westkunst exhibition. He sees the greatest failure of the curators in their ahistorical approach. Principally, they presume the division between East and West that arose after the World War II, already for the years 1939, 1929, or even for 1999. In this way, Štrauss argues, artworks from artists like, for example, Kandinsky, Malevich, Tatlin, Kupka, Brancusi, and so on, were disconnected from their real geographic and cultural historical relations and were interpreted through a political division that emerged much more later than mentioned artworks. I quote, this contradicts all facts, not only by the founders, but as well by the following generations of the avant-garde. There is definitely present their boundary with the otherness and their origins and the cultural climate of the East. The definition of the radical art called avant-garde is different than it was presented at the Westkunst exhibition. Furthermore, he reminded of the fact that in the year 1939, which curators took as a point of departure of the exhibition, that the art in 1939 in Germany belonged only conditionally to that kind of art that was presented as German in 1981. The exhibition Westkunst was as well a topic of Štrauss' lecture that he presented at the conference European Art with Focus on Eastern European Countries that took place in Cologne in 1988. Based on this lecture, he has written a study, Ostkunst, a phenomenological model, few remarks to cultural sociology of the otherness. This study was also included in his monography, Zwischen Ostkunst and Westkunst. In the introduction, Štrauss described how he would display the exhibition. In principle, he proposed to change the conception of the show. First, that it would start much earlier, already in Belle Époque, And second, he would present as well Eastern European as Western European artists altogether. Besides that, he would display not only fine arts, but as well literature, theater, and ballet, and Štrauss applied the term cultural sociology, as he regarded all artistic expressions as one connected system. The transfer of ideas between Eastern and Western Europe and their mutual attractivity doesn't end, in his opinion, by the Second World War, but it kept on continuing as well after the war. By investigating the term Ostkunst, we have to take a closer look on the use of the term that was also used to name the art conformed with the doctrine of socialist realism. To understand it better, we have to go back to the beginnings of the Cold War and to the time of emergence of the two German republics. Means we have to go back to the era of the division of Germany into Western and Eastern Germany. When 1945 the division of Germany into four parts took place, it was the base for the following division into Eastern and Western part. Shortly after the end of the World War II, a process of rehabilitation of so-called entartete Kunst, degenerated art, took place. The function of art sphere as a space for development of freedom was consciously supported. The formation of cultural field was accompanied as well in Western as in the Eastern part in Germany by vivid discussions. The development towards free artistic experience was in Eastern part very short, only 2 years, as it ended 1949 by the forthcoming Sovietization and Stalinization of the cultural sphere. The abstract art was after the World War II characterized as autonomous and identified as an international language. In the specific situation of Germany, abstract art delimits itself at least in two directions. On one hand, it establishes borders in relation to the depressing past of the National Socialism, because in Germany it was a big problem. How can we now take distance from this National Socialism and to present our culture again as a free and democratic? So at one hand, it establishes borders in relation to the past of National Socialism. On the other hand, it establishes borders in relation to the doctrine of socialist realism in Eastern Germany. That means after the end of the World War II, the art became unwillingly again an ideological and political instrument. What were the mechanisms that were used to establish Western Germany as the carrier of free and democratic art and the inheritor of the avant-garde? In this process, the exhibitions Documenta 1, 2, and 3 played a crucial role. The input of German art historian Werner Haftmann was very important, as he promoted the identity of Western art as democratic and free one. There was also a lot of written about how important it was to place the Documenta in Kassel, because Kassel lies practically on the border between Eastern and Western Germany. So it was an intentional decision to place this exhibition directly on the border of the Iron Curtain and exhibit there the art that was not possible to see and to present few kilometers behind the border in the GDR. So the difference between free democratic Western art and unfree Eastern Germany was demonstrated on all possible levels. Just a short brief excursion on the first Documenta in 1955, a rehabilitation of the degenerated art took place. There was as well a wall full of photographs, we can see it on the left side, that represented so-called Weltkunst. These were photos of artworks from prehistorical times through Renaissance till modernism. Susanne Leib argued in her study Abstraction as International Language that this horizon of Weltkunst was the point of departure, that abstract art that was formulated as universal language was included as well into Weltkunst. So this wall was therefore significant for the new direction of Western Germany and its establishing as the inheritor of modernism. The relation between official art in GDR and Westkunst transformed time by time. A great overview how Ostkunst was established in Western Germany was elaborated by German art historian Walter Graskamp in his book Die unbewältigte moderne Kunst und Öffentlichkeit that was published 1989. In this book, Graskamp reacted on the internal questions and challenges of cultural policy and art market in the 1980s that arise also due to exhibitions like the Westkunst. So he listed an overview about all the events of the 1980s that aimed to present and demonize the art of GDR in Western Germany. Graskamp wrote about numerous exhibitions and events, and at this place I would just like to pick up one important part of it. These are collectors Irene and Peter Ludwig, and they were very important also for this establishing of Ostkunst in Western Germany. By forming the notion of Ostkunst after 1989, the exhibition Westkunst Ostkunst was crucial. This exhibition took place in Ludwig Forum für internationale Kunst in Aachen, it's on the right side, in 1991. Tomáš Štrauss played a decisive role by preparation of this exhibition as a consultant. He conceived and organized as well the colloquium Westkunst Ostkunst and edited the conference volume with the same title. So let's look closer at the title Westkunst Ostkunst, separation or integration. Alone, this title evokes and provokes different dimensions of the East-West problematics that emerged after the fall of the Iron Curtain. There is again the question mark. So the first area is the questioning around if a separation or an integration takes place. The second area is the need for determination of a new position. It doesn't say anything about if this relates to Ostkunst or to Westkunst or to both. Nevertheless, here, okay, thank you very much. Just, I'm finishing now. Thank you very much. Nevertheless, here already in the title, a certain requirement will be declared. The requirement for different type of thinking, investigating, analyzing, and in the purpose of this, a requirement for a new way of reading and understanding that will move both Westkunst and Ostkunst into new position and order and contextualizes it in new relations. So I will skip this one. I would just like to mention very briefly corporate publication of Tomáš Štrauss and Boris Greuß that was published 1994. Both were invited to present a lecture with focus on Ostkunst, and we can see Greuß' contribution was titled Gibt es eine Ostkunst? ? Is there Ostkunst? And Štrauss was titled Und trotzdem die Ostkunst, and despite of it, die Ostkunst. So let me conclude by saying that the aim of this paper was the analysis and reflection of the East-West discourse, where Tomáš Štrauss played a crucial role. We have as well analyzed and critically looked at the framings that do not exist in their original form anymore, but with consequences of which we have to deal today. Štrauss was a direct witness of mentioned imbalance and asymmetry. Through his critical writings and unorthodox perspective, he contributed crucially to differentiated view that was not conform with the usual East-West rhetorics and the general binary logics of the Cold War in the 1980s and equally in the 1990s. And last slide, let me refer to a new anthology of Strauss' texts Beyond the Great Divide that was published by ICA last year and edited by Daniel Grun, Henry Mary Hughes, and Jean-Marc Poinceau. So for those who might be interested, there is the reference to this anthology. You can read more in English of his writings. And down there is also the link to my study where I have analyzed all these topics. So thank you very much for your attention.